Thanks very much to Seven Hills, to Bloomberg for having me here today with you. And sorry to cut in.
Pleasure.
But I'll keep it short. Those of you who know me for my rambling style. I'll make a special extra effort to keep it down to 10 minutes. The title is somewhat, I would say, provocative. Making capitalism great again, of course. That was designed to be so. But something quite extraordinary happened in 2008 and early 2009. By then, the world, perhaps with the exception of 3 countries, at least 3 that I can think of, I think Cuba, North Korea, and perhaps even my own native country, qualified as the 3 countries in the world that did not accept capitalism as a modus operandi. But the rest of the world had converted, including Russia, China, and essentially most of the emerging market or community of emerging market economies. Yet in 2008, there was talk, and I remember the articles, press articles in 2009 and 10, in the Western economies, particularly right here in the UK, where capitalism essentially was invented, also in the United States, where it took its modern emanation and scale. The talk of the town, people, including people who had benefited throughout their careers and lifetime from capitalism, were saying, markets seem to have failed. Our capitalist economies are not working. There was talk about socialization of losses, privatization of profits, outrage, including in parts of the world that had seen the birth of capitalism itself, or at least its modern emanation. What happened? Have we confused capitalism with globalization, with technology? I heard with great interest some of the comments that were made earlier about progress that technology and the disrupting impact of technology in our own lives, not just our businesses. Traveling up and down the country, but also in Europe and in the wider world, the 2 things that I picked up as the main objections that people had about capitalism or capital markets or our modern capitalistic economies were, first, the boom-bust cycle. That they didn't like. Why is it that a capitalist economy can only, over time, grow through these periods of rapid, accelerated growth, followed by sudden crashes with all the pain that that entails? Not just, of course, in terms of unemployment, but wreckage of lives, wreckage of careers, wreckage of businesses. So why is that boom-bust cycle so inherent to our modern capitalist economies? And then the second point that comes up and still comes up today with continued vibrancy is the 1%, 99%. No one really, I think, today challenges, including the 3 economies I mentioned earlier, which are themselves undergoing dramatic change and accepting globalization, accepting or about to accept capitalism. But why is it that so little of the accepted benefits of capitalism, which is, and it has been the best system we've come up as of yet to promote innovation, disruptive, as of course innovation always is, and its corresponding value creation, and creation, of course, of good salaries, which is what pricing power gives you when you've created innovation, when you're bringing innovation to the market. Why is it that so little of that wealth gets distributed? Why is it takes so long for the benefits of wealth creation and capital creation to filter down to the broad economy and to the population, which, of course, in that context, would be far more willing to support capitalism? And it's these 2 issues that I believe we need to answer if we want to make capitalism great again, or certainly make it popular again. And I'll start with the first one. In the last 250 years or so of recorded history, economic history, particularly of capitalism, every single major crisis in our capitalist economies has had the same root cause, the same effects, and the same long-term impact. And one book that has a supportive evidence that I would advise that if you haven't read it already, that all of you read is The Lords of Finance by Liaquat Ahmed, about the economic crisis of 1929, which shows that the causes, root cause, the impact, the reaction of both political authorities, economic authorities, financial services authorities was exactly the same as it was in 2008, with a few technological adjustments. Of course, the gold standard no longer exists. But it is our inability to properly monitor and therefore control and manage leverage in the banking industry. And if you look at every major crisis, even in the last 30 or 40 years, the asset classes change. It could be savings and loan, Latin American debt, subprime. By the way, these asset classes become bigger and bigger. But it's always the same root cause, our inability to properly control leverage in the financial services industry, and particularly the banking industry, which means that the recovery from this crisis takes an inordinate amount of time. Because leveraged, of course, leveraged economy doesn't recover as quickly as an unlevered economy. An anti-fragile economy, as Nassim Taleb in his book, The Black Swan, described as being an equity-funded SME economy. Now let's look at why that is. If you look at the regulatory, but more importantly, the fiscal framework of our Western economies, and particularly right here in Europe, our economies continue to be essentially dependent on bank lending as a way to fund the real economy. Over 80%, and that share of funding, actually, of corporate funding, is growing in Europe. Over 80% of funding comes from bank lending. Now, nothing wrong if you're a large company, if you've got plant equipment, cash flows. Securing a large bank loan at very attractive term takes only a few weeks, and that works perfectly. The problem, of course, is the rest of the economy, the SMEs, the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the disruptors, who first of all don't really need debt, mostly need equity, particularly at an early stage, but also cannot afford the guarantees, the liens, the protection that debt requires. And why is it that we depend so much in Europe, unlike the United States? Why is it that we depend so much on debt, and particularly bank debt? Well, first of all, it's heavily subsidized. In 2016, I don't have the numbers for 17. These are numbers that were produced by a professor from Harvard University and ESCP Europe. The treasuries, European treasuries, including the UK, spent 570 billion of taxpayers' money, of our money, subsidizing leverage in the financial services and particularly the banking industry. So there's a heavy subsidization, which of course makes the economy far more dependent on bank lending. And if you look at the flip side, long-term, patient capital, unlevered economy, funded by another asset class, which, by the way, was invented right here in the UK, equities, that asset class is taxed 4 times through its life cycle. The same pound or euro of equity income is taxed at the income tax level, capital gains, dividend, and also we call it a stamp duty here, a financial transaction tax, which in the UK, I believe, was set up by King William III, I think in 1698, to finance, I believe, yet another war against the French. But putting that aside, Europe structurally enjoys, promotes, and subsidizes a leverage economy that depends on bank lending for its funding and for its innovation, when we know that SMEs are looking for equities. Now let's look at the second aspect, and then we will get to the solution, or at least a proposal for a solution, which I think is quite timely in the context of the political and geopolitical development of today. The second aspect is the 1%, 99%. Ways to measure it, Gini coefficient are one of them. There are many others. But think of it a different way. An economy that is debt-driven, specifically bank debt-driven. Banks need to refinance themselves. They can use the market, but ultimately are under the control of regulators. But an economy that is debt-driven is a pyramidal financial economy. At the top, you have the state, political powers, the regulators who control the central banks, who then authorize the banks to leverage up to a certain point based on a range of somewhat complex regulation. The big companies, of course, get the bulk of that, and whatever's left gets eventually to the SMEs. Now think of an anti-fragile economy The United States, for example, the United States suffered from the crisis initially as much as Europe and other countries did. But only 18% of corporate funding is sourced from the bank or source of bank lending in the United States. And within a much, much shorter amount of time, the US economy had recovered because the other sources of long-term patient capital were available not just to large companies, but also to the small ones, to the innovators, to the disruptors. And if you have an economy where the bulk of the capital, rather than trickling down to SMEs from the top, namely from ultimately public power, central bank, a small number of banks controlling a vast majority of debt collection, deposit collection, as well as debt issuance and corporate funding, to an economy that is configured to make it easier for investors directly to contribute, to bring that capital, put it in the hands of entrepreneurs by a regulatory framework and also, importantly, a fiscal framework that facilitates that distribution of capital, you'll have indeed a far more vibrant economy. So how do we do this in the context of the challenges that we know today the UK economy faces? And I'm not just referring to the political, geopolitical, Brexit challenges, but many others. It's a competitive world. Globalization is increasing. Disruptive technologies are there. I heard earlier the minister, Matt Hancock, talking about artificial intelligence. Now think of what artificial intelligence will do when it is powered by quantum computing and powered by quantum communications, supported, for example, by quantum satellite technology. Which nation is ahead in the area of quantum satellite? It's China. They're 2 years ahead of the United States and the rest of the world. 2 years ago, they launched the world's first quantum satellite. I won't take you through quantum technology, but think of a technology that would have vastly, almost unlimited, improved throughput, instant communication that cannot be hacked by any known technologies today. And whoever will be first there, what they can do in terms of powering their economy. So the environment today is far more competitive. But the UK has a set of tremendous advantages. 5.4 million SMEs out of the 23 million that populate the European Union today. A world-class network of universities and financial expertise that, including liquid markets, could be put to good use serving those entrepreneurs, continuing the revolution, the technology revolution that started in the UK a little bit less than 10 years ago. How do we do this? Twofold proposal. First of all, we need to look at recalibrating our fiscal regime. Heavy subsidization of leverage and heavy reliance of banks through that subsidized leverage for the funding of the real economy versus heavy taxation of long-term patient capital which entrepreneurs need. This can be achieved at no cost to taxpayers. We're talking here about a recalibration. Why should we subsidize a bank that's leveraging 50 to 60 times? 60-time leverage means that a negative adverse move of 1.5% in the value of your assets, you're broke, you bust. Why should taxpayers subsidize that type of dynamic? So reducing the subsidization of debt, capping it if you wish, in exchange for reducing the taxation of long-term patient capital and equity. That is necessary, in fact, a sine qua non. But there is another opportunity which I think exists right now in the United Kingdom and has been articulated by the government and a number of ministers under the shape of the industrial strategy. How about, to support that industrial strategy, a national capital markets plan where the convening powers of the government, together with all the multiple actors in the UK, equity funding operations, crowdfunding, private equity, venture capital, the LEPs, local enterprise partnership throughout the UK, as well as many other banks, other organizations. In fact, no government money is required here. But if we were to put together all the sources of information, of training, of preparation to the raising of equity as part of a national plan with regional areas of contact for these 5.4 million SMEs so as to facilitate their access to capital. This is not about choosing winners. This is about helping these companies access those long-term patient investors, equity investors. I think that would be something to reckon which could turbocharge the technological revolution that started in the UK a little bit less than 10 years ago. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a great conference.